The morning Maude Barrett rode into Dusty Creek, New Mexico Territory, the year of 1883. She had exactly $4.60 in her coat pocket, a bruised jaw from the man she had left behind in Santa Fe, and absolutely no plan for what came next. She pulled her chestnut mare, Rosie, to a stop on the main street of the small cattle town and looked at the row of buildings that faced each other across the wide, sun-baked dirt road. There was a general store, a livery stable, a barber, a saloon with the name Lucky Draw painted across the front in fading red letters, and a small building with a hand-painted sign that read Sheriff. The whole place smelled of dust and manure and something frying in a pan somewhere nearby, and the late September sun was already bearing down with a kind of determined cruelty that made Maude squint beneath the brim of her hat. She was 24 years old, dark-haired, brown-eyed, and more capable than anyone in her life had ever given her credit for. She had grown up in Missouri, learned to keep books for her father's mercantile before he died, and then made the grievous mistake of marrying Earl Dobbins in the summer of 1881, a man who had presented himself as a stable hand, but turned out to be a man with a short fuse and long-held resentments about almost everything in the world. She had left him 6 weeks ago. She had no intention of going back. What she needed was work, something honest and steady. She climbed down from Rosie, tied the mare to the hitching post in front of the general store, and walked inside. The woman behind the counter was somewhere in her late 50s, short and stout, and wearing an expression that suggested she had seen all manner of nonsense in her years and was not particularly interested in seeing any more. She looked Maude up and down with a measuring gaze. "I am not hiring," the woman said before Maude had opened her mouth. "I am not here to apply," Maude said, though she had in fact been about to ask exactly that. "I need flour, salt pork, and whatever that smell is coming from your back room." The woman's expression softened by exactly 1 degree. "Cornbread, and I am not selling that, but flour I got." Maude bought flour and the salt pork and a small wedge of hard cheese and tried not to think about how little money she had left. When she asked the woman, whose name turned out to be Dora Higgins, whether there was anyone in town who might need a bookkeeper or a clerk or really anything at all, Dora looked at her with what might have been sympathy. "You might try the Bristol Ranch," Dora said. "It is about 4 miles north of here. They have been running without a proper hand since August, when the Miller boys left for California. The man who runs it is not the easiest person in the world to get along with, but he pays fair and on time, which is more than I can say for most." "What kind of ranch?" Maude asked. "Cattle, few horses. He breeds quarter horses on the side, sells them to the army sometimes." Dora wrapped the cornbread in cloth without being asked and slid it across the counter. "Take this. You look like you have not eaten a proper meal in some days." Maude did not argue, because that was true, and because the kindness of strangers in the West had a way of catching her off guard every time. She rode north on the road Dora had described, past scrub brush and red rock and a creek that was running low from the dry summer. The land out here was enormous in a way that still astonished her, even after 2 years in the territory. It did not comfort exactly, but it put a person's troubles in a certain perspective, the kind that came from looking at something vast and ancient and utterly indifferent to your particular sorrow. The Bristol Ranch came into view gradually, first a windmill, then the roof of a barn, then the main house, which was larger than she had expected, built solid and square from adobe and timber, with a wide porch running across the front. There were fences stretching far in every direction, well-maintained ones, and a dozen or so horses in a paddock to the left of the house. She could hear cattle somewhere to the east, a low, patient rumble of sound. She rode through the gate and into the yard and was immediately confronted by a man who came around the corner of the barn moving fast, a rope in one hand and a look on his face that could have curdled fresh milk. He was tall. Taller than she had expected, which was unreasonable of her because she had not expected anything. He had broad shoulders and dark blonde hair that needed cutting, and several days of beard on a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same red rock that dotted the landscape out here. He was probably 30 or so, and every year of those 30 looked like it had involved some form of physical labor and not nearly enough sleep. His eyes were the color of a sky just after a storm, a gray-blue that was neither warm nor cold, but somehow both at once. He stopped when he saw her and stared with an expression that was not welcoming. "This is private property," he said. His voice was deep and rough like boots on gravel, not loud, just certain. "I am aware," Maude said. "Dora Higgins in town suggested you might be in need of help. I am looking for work." He looked at her the way a man looks at a fence post he is trying to determine is rotten, a long, assessing, entirely impersonal look, and then he said, "I need a ranch hand, not a housekeeper." "Then I am not interested in being a housekeeper," Maude said. "I can keep books, I can manage supplies and accounts, I can handle horses if they are not completely ill-tempered, and I can do anything else that does not require me to be unreasonably stupid, which I am not." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood. "You got experience with cattle ranches." "No," she said, "but I learn fast and I do not waste time pretending I know something I do not." He stared at her a moment longer. "Clarence Bristol," he said finally. "Maude Barrett. You got a place to stay in town." "Not yet." He looked at the house, then back at her, and the expression on his face was the one people wear when they are making a decision they are not entirely sure about. "There is a room at the back of the house, used to be for the foreman. It is yours if you want it as part of the arrangement. $20 a month. I have accounts that have not been properly organized since April, a ledger that needs maintaining, and a supplier in Las Cruces who has been overcharging me and I cannot prove it because I am behind on the books. You fix that situation, we will talk about what else needs doing." "I will take it," Maude said. He nodded once, turned around and went back to whatever he had been doing with the rope, and that was, apparently, the end of the conversation. She was left sitting on Rosie in the middle of the yard, watching his retreating back and thinking that Dora Higgins had not been wrong. He was, in fact, not the easiest person in the world to get along with. But there was something honest about his bluntness that Maude found, in a strange way, more comfortable than charm. She had been charmed before. It had not gone well. She brought Rosie to the stable herself, found an empty stall, and spent 20 minutes making sure the mare was comfortable and fed before she went looking for the house. The room at the back was simple, just a bed with a good mattress, a wooden dresser, a window that faced east, and a hook on the wall for clothes. It was clean. There was no dust on the windowsill, which told her something about the man, even if she was not sure yet what. She found the ledger that evening, sitting on a desk in a small room off the main hallway that served as an office. The ledger was, in fact, a disaster, not because the numbers were necessarily wrong, but because they had been entered with no consistency, sometimes by date, sometimes by type of expense, sometimes apparently by whatever mood the person writing had been in at the time. There were receipts stuffed between pages, some of them dated months apart from the entries they appeared to correspond to. Maude sat down at the desk, lit the lamp, and began to work. She was still working 2 hours later when she heard boots on the floorboards and looked up to find Clarence Bristol standing in the doorway of the office with 2 mugs of coffee, looking at her the way people look at things they did not expect to find in the places they are looking. "I made coffee," he said, which was clearly evident, and held out one of the mugs. Maude took it. It was strong enough to do structural damage to a lesser person, which she appreciated. "Thank you." He looked at the ledger, which she had already reorganized into a separate column system, with the loose receipts set aside in a pile sorted by date. "You have been at this for 2 hours, he said. "The Las Cruces supplier," Maude said. "His name is Alderson, yes, based on these invoices. Yes. He has been overcharging you on feed grain, not dramatically but consistently. A few cents per hundredweight each time, which adds up. Over 6 months he owes you approximately $11.30. Clarence Bristol looked at the ledger and then at her. "You found that in 2 hours. The books are not complicated once they are organized. They are just not organized. She set down her coffee. I can have them fully in order by Friday if you will answer questions when I have them. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "All right," and left the room, taking his coffee with him. She went back to work. Over the following week, Maude settled into the rhythm of the Bristol ranch in the way she settled into most things, by paying close attention and saying very little until she understood what she was looking at. She spent her mornings on the books and her afternoons exploring the operation, learning which horses were which, understanding the grazing rotation Clarence used for his cattle, watching how he managed the two remaining hands he employed. A quiet older Mexican man named Esteban who had worked the ranch for years, and a younger man named Holt who was 19 and enthusiastic in a way that got him into trouble approximately twice a week. Clarence himself was a man of few words and considerable competence. She watched him work and was struck repeatedly by how efficient he was. No wasted motion, no wasted time. He built fence where fence needed building, doctored sick cattle without complaint, repaired equipment with the particular focused patience of a person who understood that things broke, and the only response to that was to fix them. He was rough in the sense that the land itself was rough. He did not soften his words with pleasantries or ease into difficult subjects with gentle approaches. When she made an error in the ledger, which happened once in the first week because she had misread his handwriting on a purchase receipt, he said, "That number is wrong, it should be 14 not 40, and nothing else. No apology for the bad handwriting, no softening of the correction." She did not want softening. She wanted accurate numbers. But she also noticed in those first weeks other things. She noticed that he always made sure Esteban's pay was in his hands before sunset on the last day of the month, without waiting to be asked. She noticed that when one of the ranch's older horses, a gray gelding named Forrester, became lame, Clarence spent 3 evenings working with the horse's leg himself rather than having Holt do it, and she heard him talking to the horse quietly in the lamplight of the stable, in a voice that was nothing like the one he used with people, low and patient, and not at all rough. She noticed that every morning, without fail, there was coffee made in the kitchen when she came out to start her day, and that the amount in the pot was always exactly right for 2 people, though he had made no production of this and she had made no comment on it. She noticed that when a dust storm came in from the west on the 10th day of her time there, and she was out at the paddock fence trying to get a gate closed against the wind, he appeared beside her without a word and helped her with the gate and then stayed beside her as they ran for the house, and when a piece of flying debris clipped her shoulder, he stopped, right there in the middle of the storm, and asked, "Are you hurt?" with a directness and seriousness that made something catch in her chest. "It is nothing," she said. He looked at her shoulder for another moment, decided she was probably right, and then they ran the rest of the way to the house. That evening, after the storm had passed and they had swept out what dust had gotten into the main rooms, Clarence set out a small tin of liniment on the kitchen table without looking at her and said, "For the shoulder." She used it. It helped. She did not make a fuss about it, and neither did he, which was, she was beginning to understand its own kind of language. By the end of October, the books were fully in order. She had written a formal letter to Alderson in Las Cruces detailing the discrepancy in the invoices, and Clarence had read the letter, said, "That is good," and signed it. A week later, a response arrived by post with a corrected invoice and a bank draft for $11.40, which was slightly more than she had calculated because she had missed a partial overcharge from January. "You were close," Clarence said when she showed him. "I was 40 cents off." "Close," he said again, and there was something in his expression that was as close to approval as she suspected he typically got. As November settled over the ranch and the nights turned cold and the days grew short, Maude found herself thinking about Clarence Bristol with a frequency and a specific attention that she recognized, despite herself, as something more than professional interest. It unsettled her. She had made a serious mistake once already in trusting her heart over her judgment, and she was not eager to repeat it. Moreover, the man had given her no particular reason to think he thought of her as anything other than an employee who was doing a satisfactory job with his accounts. And yet, there were the small things. The coffee every morning, which continued with perfect consistency. The fact that when she mentioned, once, that she found the kitchen too dark in the evenings because the single lamp was not enough to see well by, a second lamp appeared on the kitchen shelf the following morning, with no commentary from him whatsoever. The fact that on the evenings when she stayed late in the office working, she would often hear him in the hallway, and sometimes he would stop and stand in the doorway for a moment, not saying anything, and then move on, as if he had simply needed to know she was there. The evening that changed things began unremarkably. It was the 14th of November, and the temperature had dropped sharply, and after supper, which they had eaten in the kitchen as they always did, with Esteban gone home to the small house on the edge of the property where he lived with his wife, and Holt bunked down in the bunkhouse, Maude found herself sitting beside the fireplace in the main room with a cup of tea, going over a new supply order. Clarence was in the armchair across from her, working on a piece of tack that needed stitching, and they had been sitting in companionable silence for some time, which was one of the things about him she had come to value. That silence with Clarence Bristol did not feel like absence but like presence. He looked up from the leather and said without prelude, "Where did you come from before here?" She looked up from her papers. He was watching her with those gray-blue eyes, steady and direct. "Santa Fe most recently," she said, "and before that, Missouri." He nodded. "What brought you to the territory?" She set the papers down on her knee. She had decided some time ago to be honest with herself about what she was, which was a woman who had made a poor choice and gotten out of it and was not ashamed of either fact. "I was married," she said. "I left." He held her gaze. He did not ask the kind of questions that most people would ask, the questions that were really judgments wearing the clothing of curiosity. He just nodded once, the same way he nodded when information registered with him and required no comment. "I am sorry," he said. That it was not what it should have been. It was such a simple thing to say, and so exactly the right thing, that Maude had to look back down at her papers for a moment to compose herself. "How long have you had this ranch?" she asked when she trusted her voice. 8 years, he said. "I came out from Texas. My father had a spread there, but there were 5 of us boys and the land was divided and divided until it was not enough. I came out here with what I had and built it. Alone, mostly." He returned his attention to the tack. "Esteban was here before me, actually. The previous owner left in a hurry and Esteban stayed. He knows this land better than I do." "And you have never," she stopped herself. He looked up again. "Never what?" "It is none of my business." "You can ask," he said. She met his eyes. "You have never married." The silence stretched a moment, not uncomfortably, but deliberately, the way his silences often felt, like he was choosing what to say with the same care he applied to everything else. "No," he said. "I came close once, 6 years ago, a woman in El Paso, but the ranch was at a difficult point and she did not want to wait, and I did not blame her for that." He paused. "I was also at that point in my life a harder person than I am now, not easy company." Maude looked at him steadily. "I would not exactly describe you as easy company now," she said. Something happened to his face. It was not a full smile. She was not certain his face entirely knew how to do a full smile, but it was something warm and genuine that transformed him for a moment into a person who was quite arrestingly handsome when he was not wearing his default expression of focused severity. "No," he agreed. "I suppose not." After that evening, something shifted between them, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but in the way that rivers shift their courses, slowly, inevitably, according to pressures that have been building for some time. They talked more in the evenings. Not long conversations, not declarations of any kind, but real ones, the kind where both people are actually saying something. She learned that he had read more than she would have expected, that there was a crate of books under his bed, because the shelves in the main room were full. She learned that he had a dry and unexpected sense of humor that emerged rarely but was worth waiting for. She learned that he was sending money every month to his mother in Texas, who was widowed now, and that he did this without ever mentioning it to anyone, that she only found out because she was keeping the accounts and she had asked about the regular bank draft. He learned that she could whistle, which she did sometimes when she was working in the stable, and that she had an opinion on nearly every subject that she would share if asked, but not otherwise. He learned that she was afraid of almost nothing except enclosed spaces, which stemmed from an incident in childhood involving a root cellar and a stuck door, and that she was perfectly willing to explain this without embarrassment. He learned that she was capable of laughing in a way that was entirely unguarded and came from somewhere deep, the kind of laugh that made everyone within earshot want to know what the joke was. December came, and with it, the particular hard cold of the New Mexico high desert at night, and the way the stars looked like someone had cracked open the sky itself and let the light through. The days were short and the work was steady, and the ranch had the particular quiet of a place that has settled into its winter routine. There was a Saturday in mid-December when Dora Higgins sent word with Holt, who had gone into town for supplies, that there was to be a gathering at the schoolhouse on Saturday evening, a sort of community Christmas celebration, and would the folks at the Bristol ranch please come and bring something for the table. Clarence read the note and set it on the kitchen table. He said nothing. Maude, who had been watching him read it, said, "Would you like to go?" He looked at her with the particular expression that meant he was thinking about something he was not going to say directly. "Do you want to go?" he asked. "I think it might be nice," she said. "I have not met many people in town yet." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. They arrived at the schoolhouse on Saturday evening with a pot of Maude's venison stew, which Clarence had declared capable of feeding a reasonable number of people, which was his version of a compliment. The schoolhouse was warm and loud and strung with pine boughs that someone had brought in from somewhere, and there were perhaps 40 people in a space meant for 30, all of them talking at once. Dora Higgins appeared immediately, took the pot of stew, declared it excellent before she had tasted it, and led Maude off to introduce her to several women who seemed pleased to see a new face. Maude went, casting a glance back at Clarence, who had planted himself near the wall with the particular stillness of a man who was physically present and intended to remain so, and had absolutely no interest in being introduced to anyone. She found herself talking, genuinely talking, for the first time in months, with the kind of ease that comes when the people around you are simply interested rather than calculating. There was a woman named Ruth Caldwell who was married to the town's only doctor and had opinions about everything and expressed them freely, and a girl named Patience Alvarez who was 19 and funny and helped her mother run the laundry, and a heavy-set man named George Trout who managed the Lucky Draw Saloon and had, it turned out, a genuine and touching interest in beekeeping, which he practiced behind the saloon and was more than happy to explain at length. At some point in the evening, a fiddle and a guitar started up in the corner and the floor was cleared and people began to dance. Maude watched from the edge of the room, tapping her foot to the music, and then felt a presence beside her and turned to find Clarence, who had apparently moved from his position near the wall without her noticing. "I should tell you," he said, not looking at her, looking at the dancers, "that I cannot dance." "Cannot or will not?" she asked. He considered this. "Both," he said. "I have never managed to learn the steps without feeling like a horse that has been asked to do something against its nature." Maude laughed, and he glanced sideways at her with that not-quite smile, and she had the sudden, clear-headed, entirely inconvenient understanding that she was in very real danger of falling in love with this man. "Then we will watch," she said, and they stood together at the edge of the dance floor, close enough that their arms nearly touched, watching the couples turn and step in the lamplight, and neither of them moved away. On the ride back to the ranch, In the cold dark of the December night, with their breath-making clouds in the air and the stars blazing overhead, they were quiet. Not awkwardly quiet, but in the way they had learned to be quiet together, with a fullness to it, a sense of two people occupying the same silence and finding it sufficient. After they had stabled the horses and were walking toward the house, Clarence stopped. She stopped too and turned to look at him. He was standing in the yard with the lamplight from the house making a golden rectangle across the ground in front of them, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, unguarded and careful at once, the expression of a person standing on the edge of something and deciding whether to step. "Maude," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "I am glad you came to this ranch." She held his gaze. "So am I," she said. It was, for both of them, quite a lot to say. The week before Christmas, a stranger arrived at the ranch. He came in the late afternoon, riding a black horse that was too good for the saddle it was carrying, and he sat in the yard and called out until Clarence appeared from the barn. His name was Warren Dobbins, and he was Earl Dobbins' brother, and he was not there to cause any particular trouble, which was, Maude thought when Clarence brought her this information, almost more unsettling than if he had been. He had a letter from Earl, he said. He just wanted to deliver it. He would be on his way after. Clarence had not let him into the house. He handed Maude the letter in the kitchen and stood by the window while she read it, not out of nosiness, but because his instinct, apparently, was to be physically present in situations that might require it. The letter was from Earl, and it said that he understood she had left, and he was not going to argue about it, and that he had gone to live with his brother in Albuquerque, and that he wanted her to know he was not going to come after her. He thought she deserved to know that. He also asked in the final line that she not think too badly of him in time, which was the most complicated request she had received from anyone in some time. She set the letter down on the table. "Is it bad news?" Clarence asked. "No," she said. "Actually, it is something like good news. He is not coming after me." Clarence looked at her with steady eyes. "Were you afraid that he might?" She considered the question honestly. "In the back of my mind," she said. "Yes." He nodded slowly. "Then I am glad you know." Warren Dobbins was given a meal and a place to sleep in the bunkhouse for the night because the temperature had dropped hard and Esteban had pressed the case. And in the morning he rode south, and that was the end of it. Maude watched him go from the porch and felt something in her chest that had been coiled tight for 6 weeks slowly, incrementally, begin to ease. Christmas at the Bristol ranch was modest and quiet, and one of the best days Maude had experienced in several years. Esteban and his wife, Maria, came for the midday meal, and Maria brought tamales she had made herself and a pot of pozole, and Maude had baked bread and made a dried apple cake, and Clarence had, with absolutely no advance announcement, produced a small bottle of good whiskey and poured 4 glasses with the air of a man who was not going to explain himself. They ate and talked, and afterward Holt, who had gone home to his family in town, came back with a paper-wrapped package that turned out to be a hand-carved wooden horse, rough but recognizable, that he had made himself and left on the table with a note that just said, "For the ranch," which was, they all agreed, just right. Clarence gave Esteban and Maria each an envelope with a Christmas bonus, which Esteban accepted with his characteristic quiet dignity. He gave Maude a book. It was a well-made copy of a collection of poems, the kind that was small enough to carry in a coat pocket, and when she turned it over in her hand she found that inside the front cover, in Clarence's deliberate handwriting, he had written simply, "For the winter evenings." CB. She looked up at him. He was looking at the tablecloth. "It is a good book," he said to the tablecloth. "It is a wonderful book," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. On New Year's Eve, they were alone, Esteban and Maria gone, Holt gone to town for the celebration, and the ranch was still and cold, and the sky was extraordinary. After supper, Maude made a pot of good strong tea and brought it to the main room, and they sat in their customary positions by the fireplace, and at some point they stopped pretending to read or work and simply talked. She told him things she had not told anyone in the territory, about her father's mercantile in Missouri, and how she had kept those books from the age of 14, and how she had always been good with numbers, but it had never seemed particularly remarkable until suddenly, in a different life, it had saved her. About the mistake of her marriage, not the anger of it, which she had largely worked through, but the particular grief of discovering that a person was not who you had believed them to be. He listened without interruption, which was another thing about him she had come to deeply appreciate, that he listened as if what she was saying mattered, as if he was making room for it. And then he told her, in the way he did things, carefully and without drama, that the year he was 25 he had been in a bad fight in El Paso, not one he had started but one he had finished, and that a man had been badly hurt and Clarence had spent 3 months in terrible uncertainty about whether there would be legal consequences and what kind of man that made him, and that the experience had changed the way he thought about anger and about force. That it was why he preferred to solve things with work and words now when there was any choice in the matter. "You told me once," Maude said, "that you were a harder person 6 years ago." "Yes. What changed you?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "I spent a lot of time alone out here, and the land has a way of teaching you your actual size, which is small, and then once you understand that, the things you were using all that hardness to protect yourself from seem less important." She looked at him across the fireplace. The light made his face softer, or perhaps that was just the way he was looking at her. "I do not think you are hard," she said. He held her gaze. "I know you do not," he said. "That is something I have been thinking about." The clock on the mantel, which Maude suspected was slightly fast, ticked toward midnight. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a coyote called, and the fire snapped, and Clarence set down his cup and looked at her with an expression that was entirely open, the most unguarded she had ever seen him, and said, "I would like to tell you something, and I would like to say it plainly because I do not know how to say things any other way." "Then say it plainly," she said. "I have spent 8 years on this ranch, and I have built it into something that works and something I am proud of. And for most of that time I told myself that was enough," he said. "What I did not account for was the possibility that someone would arrive on a chestnut mare with a bruised jaw and $4 in her pocket and reorganize my ledger in 2 hours, and have opinions about everything and laugh like that, and make the whole place feel different." He stopped. "I am in love with you, Maude. That is what I wanted to say." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and outside the coyote called again, and the new year was coming over the horizon whether anyone was ready for it or not. And Maude Barrett set down her tea and looked at Clarence Bristol and felt something in her that had been very carefully closed begin, with enormous relief, to open. "Clarence," she said, "I have been in love with you since approximately the day I realized you were talking to that gray horse in the stable." He stared at her. "Forrester, you were telling him that the leg would be fine and that he should stop worrying about it." He seemed distressed. "You were very kind about it." She held his gaze. "That is the thing about you that I noticed first, that you are kind in the places where you think no one is watching." He crossed the room and she stood, and he took her hands in his, very carefully, the way a person handles something they are not prepared to be careless with, and he said, "I have not done this particularly well in the past. Caring about someone, I tend to show things rather than say them." "I know," she said. "I have been watching you show things for 3 months." She looked up at him. "I find it very eloquent." He kissed her then, quietly and seriously, and with the same deliberate fullness that characterized everything else he did, and she kissed him back. And the clock ticked past midnight and into the new year of 1884, and the fire burned warmly around them, and the cold stars blazed outside the windows of the Bristol ranch, and neither of them noticed any of it. January moved through the ranch with its hard, clear cold, and the thing between Clarence and Maude was new and real and quietly extraordinary. It was not the kind of love that announced itself with dramatic gestures. It was the kind that lived in the daily fabric of a shared life, that grew in the particular way of things that have good soil and regular water and time. He asked her, on the 15th of January, in the kitchen while they were both occupied with their respective morning tasks, without looking up from the harness he was repairing at the table, whether she would consider making their arrangement permanent. She looked up from the ledger she was updating. "Are you asking me to marry you, Clarence?" He looked up then. "Yes," he said, "I am." She put down her pen. She looked at him, this large, quiet, difficult, generous man who made coffee for two every morning and talked to sick horses and paid his people on time and had never once in 3 months raised his voice or his hand and had told her he loved her in plain words by the firelight on New Year's Eve. "Yes," she said. He nodded and returned to the harness and then set it down again and said, "I want to do this properly. I will get a ring, and we should speak to the Reverend in town." "We should," she agreed. "Next week, next week." He picked up the harness again, she picked up her pen. And the ordinary morning continued around them, warm and full of something that Maude thought she could only describe as rightness, the particular satisfaction of being exactly where you are supposed to be. They were married on the 2nd Saturday of February, 1884, in the small white church at the edge of Dusty Creek. Dora Higgins was there, and Ruth Caldwell and her husband the doctor, and Patience Alvarez who cried in a cheerful and unapologetic way, and George Trout who brought a jar of honey from his bees as a gift, and Esteban and Maria who sat in the front row with the quiet dignity of people who had seen enough of the world to know when a good thing was happening. Holt stood up with Clarence, badly pressed but earnest, and wore an expression of profound responsibility throughout the entire ceremony. The Reverend was a small, energetic man named Gideon Marsh, who had been marrying people in Dusty Creek for 12 years, and had opinions about the sanctity of the undertaking that he expressed at some length in his opening remarks. Maude listened, and thought that she agreed with most of them. When Reverend Marsh asked Clarence if he took this woman, Clarence said, "I do," in the same voice he used for everything, low and certain and without qualification, and Maude thought it was the most convincing thing she had ever heard. When he asked Maude, she said, "I do," and meant it in every direction. The ring was silver with a small inset turquoise stone, the kind that came from the mines in the territory, and when Clarence had shown it to her the evening before, he had said, "I thought something from the land out here was right," and she had agreed and put it on her finger and it had fit perfectly, which she took as a sign of something. They walked back out into the February sunshine as husband and wife, and Maude looked up at the enormous New Mexico sky and felt no desire to be anywhere else in the world. The spring of 1884 came in hard and bright, the way springs did in the territory, with late frosts and then sudden warmth, and then the green that came up startlingly fast from the dry ground once the rains came. The ranch was busy with new calves and the horses that needed working, and Maude had taken on an additional responsibility that had emerged naturally from her position. She had begun corresponding with a horse buyer in El Paso on Clarence's behalf, negotiating prices for the quarter horses he bred, and had, to his visible satisfaction, secured prices consistently better than he had been getting before. "You are better at this than I am," he said one evening, after she reported that she had gotten $30 more per head than his previous arrangement with the buyer. "I am better at the letters," she said. "You are better at knowing which horses to sell." "A partnership," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "That is exactly what it is." She found herself happy in a way that felt different from any happiness she had known before, not the bright, unsustainable happiness of things that are new, but something deeper and more consistent, the happiness of a life that fits, of days that add up to something. In April, Esteban came to find her in the garden she was beginning to establish behind the house, not a kitchen garden exactly, though she intended to grow vegetables but also flowers, because she had decided that a ranch could have both functionality and beauty and that these were not contradictory aims. Esteban removed his hat and held it in front of him and said, in the formal way he had with important things, "Senora Bristol, I have been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said. "My nephew," he said. "He is 18, a good boy, a hard worker. He has been in Mexico, but he wants to come north. If Senor Bristol is willing, he could be a good hand here, and I would vouch for him." She talked to Clarence that evening, and he listened to all of it and said, "Tell Esteban to write to the boy. If he is half as good as Esteban, that is more than enough." The nephew, a young man named Tomás who arrived in May with one bag and a wide-eyed look at the scale of the landscape that Maude recognized from her own first view of the territory, turned out to be every bit as steady and capable as Esteban had promised. He was quiet in the way Esteban was quiet, and he learned fast, and within 2 months he was managing the morning feeding rotation without supervision. There was an afternoon in June when a rider came to the ranch from the direction of the army fort to the south, a sergeant named Collins who had come to discuss the possibility of a horse contract. Clarence met him in the yard, and Maude brought out water, and the three of them sat on the porch and discussed the terms. The army wanted 12 horses in the autumn, well-trained quarter horses that could handle the terrain of the territory. The price they offered first was low. Clarence heard it without reaction. Maude set her glass of water down and said, pleasantly, "That price does not account for the training time or the quality of the breed. The Bristol horses are not the same as what you would pick up at a general sale." Sergeant Collins looked at her with the particular expression of a man who had not expected to be negotiating with a woman and was recalibrating rapidly. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the correct price is $45 per head for horses of this quality," Maude said. "I have the sales records from El Paso if you would like to review them." The contract was signed at $42 per head, which was still better than Clarence had ever gotten from the army, and the sergeant rode away appearing to have been educated in some way he had not anticipated. Clarence watched him go and then looked at Maude with an expression that was full and warm and not at all concealed. "You are something," he said. She bumped her shoulder against his. "I am practical," she said. "Same thing," he said, and she laughed, and he caught her hand and held it. By midsummer, Maude knew she was pregnant. She told Clarence on a Tuesday morning in July, directly, because she could not imagine doing it any other way with him, and he went very still in the way he did when something mattered enormously. Then he put both hands on her shoulders gently, and looked at her with an expression that was so openly full of feeling that it made her eyes sting. "Are you well?" he asked first. "Are you feeling well?" "Yes," she said. "I feel fine." He pulled her into his arms and held her with that careful, deliberate gentleness that she had come to understand was simply who he was. The roughness on the outside of him was the language he used with the world, and the tenderness was the reality beneath it, the thing he reserved for the things he loved most. "I am going to be a father," he said against her hair. It was not directed at her, she thought. It was more that he was telling himself, establishing it as real. "In February, I expect," she said. "I am going to write to Ruth Caldwell. Her husband is the doctor." "Yes," he said. "Yes, please do that today." "Clarence," she said, pulling back to look at him, "you are not to fuss." "I am not going to fuss," he said immediately, in the voice of a man who was absolutely going to fuss. She gave him her most level look. He held it for a moment and then said, "I will try not to fuss extensively." "That is more honest," she agreed. He fussed. He fussed in the particular way that was characteristic of him, meaning he did not hover or make a production of anything, but he quietly rearranged the entire operation of the ranch so that nothing heavy was anywhere near her vicinity, and he added a chair to the office so that she had a comfortable place to sit when she was working. And he learned to make a ginger tea that Ruth Caldwell's husband recommended for morning discomfort, and produced it every morning without commentary for the 3 weeks she needed it. The autumn arrived in its glory, gold and red, and the clean, sharp smell of cold coming, and the army horses were delivered, and the contract was honored, and the payment came in, and Maude put it in the ledger with satisfaction. The ranch was doing well. Better than well, actually. The combination of Clarence's instinctive understanding of land and animals and Maude's management of accounts and correspondence and negotiation had made the operation more efficient and more profitable than either could have achieved alone, which was not a surprise to either of them. One October afternoon, when the light was long and gold and the leaves on the cottonwoods along the creek were turning yellow, Maude was sitting on the porch with her book of poems, the one Clarence had given her for Christmas, and Clarence came and sat beside her, which he sometimes did in the late afternoons when the day's work reached a natural pause. They sat in the companionable silence that was still, after all these months, one of her favorite things about being with him. "Are you happy?" he asked, which was not a question he asked often, partly because the answer was usually visible, but perhaps he needed to hear it today. She looked at him. The October light was on his face, and there were lines around his eyes that she found beautiful in the way that things earned through living are beautiful, and he was watching her with that steady gray-blue gaze that still had the power to make her feel entirely known. "Clarence," she said, "I am the happiest I have ever been." He nodded, taking this in. Then he said, "Good, that is what I want for you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which she had begun doing recently because she could, and he put his arm around her, and they sat on the porch of the Bristol ranch in the October afternoon and watched the horses in the paddock and the hawks turning on the thermals above the red rocks to the west. November brought a different kind of test. A cattle buyer came through the territory, claiming to represent a group of investors in Chicago who were buying up ranches in the New Mexico territory at large scale. His name was Pemberton, and he was well-dressed and smooth in a way that made Maude's instincts alert immediately, and he sat at their kitchen table and made an offer for the Bristol ranch that was, he said, extremely generous. Clarence heard the offer with no expression whatsoever. Then he said, "No." Pemberton smiled the smile of a man who expected this and had prepared for it. He spoke about the cattle market, about the drought years that were predicted, about the difficulties of maintaining an independent operation against the increasing consolidation of the cattle industry. He spoke about the amount Clarence could take away and what he could do with it. He spoke about Chicago. He spoke at considerable length. When he finished, Clarence said, "No." Pemberton turned to Maude, apparently deciding to try a different approach, and said, "Perhaps your wife would like to weigh in on the offer." Maude looked at him pleasantly. "My husband said no," she said. "That is also my answer. We are not interested in selling. Thank you for coming." Pemberton left without his sale and with the particular expression of a man who had underestimated both of the people in a room and knew it. After he was gone, Clarence looked at her. "You were very polite," he said, with the tone that meant he had noticed she was being more polite than she perhaps felt. "It seemed sufficient," she said. "It was more than sufficient," he said. And there it was again, that warmth in his eyes that she had come to live inside of. There was a conversation in December that Maude did not hear directly but understood from its aftermath. Esteban told her carefully that there had been some trouble at the edge of the ranch's southern boundary, where the land bordered a property owned by a man named Garrett who had arrived in the area that summer and had been moving his cattle onto the Bristol land without acknowledgement. She knew that Clarence had ridden down to speak to Garrett, and that the conversation had been brief and direct, and that Garrett had apparently taken the point, because there was no further incursion. But she also knew, from the way Clarence came back that evening with the careful stillness of a man who has kept himself in control of something that did not want to be controlled, that the conversation had not been easy. That evening she sat beside him and said, "Did it go all right?" "It is settled," he said. Was there any? She paused, choosing her words. Did it escalate? He looked at her steadily. "I told him his cattle were on my land and that if they were there again I would take the matter to the sheriff. He understood that." She searched his face. "And you are all right?" "Yes," he said, and then more quietly, "I am not the man I was in El Paso. I want you to know that." "I do know that," she said firmly. "I knew it before you told me." He looked at her for a moment and then said, "Thank you," in a way that meant more than the words alone. February of 1885 arrived, and with it, on the 9th day, a son. He came in the night, in the proper room of the ranch house, with Ruth Caldwell's husband present and Maria, who knew about these things and had seen many children into the world. And it was not easy, as these things seldom are, but it was not terrible either. And when it was done and Maude was exhausted and utterly victorious and holding the boy in her arms, Clarence was there beside her in the chair that had been placed next to the bed, and he was holding her hand. And he had been holding it for most of the previous 6 hours, and she had squeezed it hard enough during the worst of it that she had worried briefly about his fingers, but he had not made a sound of complaint. The boy was red-faced and vocal and entirely healthy, and Clarence looked at him with an expression of such enormous, undefended feeling that Maude thought it was the most she had ever loved him. "What do we call him?" she asked. Clarence had been thinking about this for months. She knew because she had watched him think about it. He said, "If you are agreeable, I would like to call him James, after your father." Her father. Her father, whose mercantile had taught her to keep books, who had believed she was capable of anything and had died before she could show him how right he was. She looked at her husband through eyes that were, despite her best efforts, quite wet. "That is exactly what we should call him," she said. James Bristol was, from his first days, a person with strong preferences and the vocal capacity to express them, which made the early weeks energetic in a way that no one had quite anticipated. Clarence, who had never been around an infant in any significant capacity, adapted with the same steady practicality he applied to every unfamiliar situation, which was to observe carefully and then simply do what was needed. He was extraordinary with the baby. This should not have surprised Maude, given everything she knew about him, and yet it did in the best possible way. He held James with the same careful deliberateness with which he handled everything he valued, and he talked to him. She heard him doing it through the wall at night sometimes, low and even, the same voice he used with the horses, as if the child were simply a small creature who needed reassurance that the world was manageable. Spring came again, and James began to make sounds that were clearly intended to be communication, and were received with great seriousness by everyone on the ranch. Esteban was particularly enchanted, and Tomás, who had now been on the ranch for a full year and was as settled as if he had always been there, made a small carved horse for James that was placed in the corner of the nursery. Holt, who was 20 now and considerably less chaotic than he had been at 19, had taken on more responsibility and was managing the cattle rotation on the east pastures with genuine skill. Clarence told him, in the way Clarence told people things, directly and without decoration, that he was doing good work. Holt received this with the expression of someone who had just been handed something he had not known he was waiting for. In the summer of 1885, the ranch received a visitor of a different kind. A woman arrived from the East, a journalist from a magazine in St. Louis that was running a series of articles about life in the Western Territories. Her name was Evelyn Glass, and she was 28 and completely undaunted by anything, and she arrived with a notebook and a camera and an air of absolute determination to record what she saw accurately. She had written ahead asking permission to document the operation of a working ranch, and Clarence, after considerable deliberation and Maude's gentle encouragement, had agreed to a 3-day visit. Evelyn Glass turned out to be excellent company. She ate whatever was put in front of her, asked questions of everyone with genuine curiosity, photographed the horses and the cattle and the wide sweep of the land, and at the end of 3 days sat with Maude on the porch and said, "I have been to 4 ranches on this trip. This is the only one where the books are in order and the horses look happy." Maude laughed. "I am responsible for the books. He is responsible for the horses." "A team," Evelyn said, scribbling something. "How did you come to be here?" "I rode in," Maude said, "and he needed his ledger organized." Evelyn looked up from her notebook. "And the rest?" Maude looked out at the yard where Clarence was working with a young horse on a lead line, patient and steady, moving with the horse rather than against it. James was in the sling on her chest, sleeping. "The rest," she said, "was simply paying attention." The article, when it appeared in the magazine some months later, and a copy made its way to the ranch via Dora Higgins, who had ordered the issue with specific purpose, described the Bristol Ranch as an example of what was possible in the territory when competence and care were applied in equal measure. It mentioned Maude by name and described Clarence as a man who had built something from nothing through sheer force of will and kept it through wisdom. He read this description, set the magazine down, and said nothing for a moment. "Is it accurate?" Maude asked. "I suppose," he said, "though the wisdom part is debatable." "It is not debatable," she said. He looked at her with that particular expression that was full and warm and always made her feel as though she were standing in good light. "Come here," he said quietly. She went. By the time James was taking his first determined, wobbling steps across the kitchen floor of the ranch house, the Bristol operation had grown to include a more formal breeding program for the quarter horses, which was Maude's proposal based on the correspondence she had been maintaining with buyers in 3 different cities. Clarence had listened to the proposal over a Sunday supper and asked specific, intelligent questions for 45 minutes, and then said, "Yes, let us do it." The breeding program required capital to start, which they had, carefully accumulated in the ranch accounts over 2 years of good management. It also required a more detailed record-keeping system than they had previously used, which Maude designed herself, a system for tracking lineage and health records and training notes for each horse, which Clarence reviewed and improved with his own observations about what information was actually useful, and the result was something that worked better than either version alone. This was, Maude thought, a fairly good metaphor for their life. Autumn of 1886. James was 20 months old and fully mobile, and had opinions about everything, which was, Clarence observed with the dry expression that meant he found something both amusing and familiarly accurate, not entirely surprising. Esteban turned 55 that fall, and the celebration at the ranch was the most festive they had hosted, with Maria's cooking and Tomaz's guitar, and Holt's genuinely shocking ability to do a card trick. He had been practicing for 3 months that even Clarence admitted was impressive. Dora Higgins drove out from town with Ruth Caldwell and her husband and George Trout, who brought honey and a small speech about the importance of community, which was heartfelt and moderately long. It was the kind of evening that existed to be remembered. Maude sat beside her husband in the lamplight of the main room, which had been cleared of furniture and had people standing and sitting in every corner, and James was asleep in the bedroom with Maria checking on him, and Clarence's hand found hers under the table and held it simply, and she thought, looking around at all of it, that this was the shape of a life she had built from almost nothing. From $4.60 and a bruised jaw and the willingness to ride north on a road she had never been down before, she leaned close to Clarence and said, low enough that only he could hear, "Do you remember the first thing you said to me?" He thought about it. "This is private property," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was not particularly welcoming." "No," she agreed. "You were not." He looked at her steadily, and there was that warmth again, consistent and deep, the kind she had come to understand was simply always there under everything, steady as the land itself. "Are you registering a complaint?" he asked. "Absolutely not," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to it briefly, which he did sometimes, in the way he did everything, quietly and with complete sincerity, and she thought that there was not a person in the world she would rather be beside. By 1887, the Bristol horse breeding program had established a reputation that extended well beyond the territory. There were buyers coming from Colorado and Kansas now, and a man from Denver who had heard of the quarter horses through the Army contract and wanted to commission 6 specifically for a ranch he was establishing in Wyoming. The Denver commission was the largest single transaction they had handled, and Maude managed the correspondence and the contracts with the concentration she brought to everything important. And when the 6 horses were delivered in June and the payment came through, she sat down at the ledger and looked at the number for a long moment. Clarence was standing in the doorway of the office, "Well," he said. "We are doing well," she said, and then, because numbers were her language and she knew he understood this, "we could expand the paddock area and add 2 more breeding mares without it causing any strain on the accounts." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her across the desk. "What would you want?" he said. "Not the ranch. You." She set down the pen and looked at him. "I want the mares," she said. "I want the breeding program to be what it can be, and I want," she paused, "I want another child when the time is right." He came into the office and sat in the chair across from the desk, the chair he always occupied when they were working through something together, and looked at her with full attention. "The time seems right to me," he said, "if you agree." "I do," she said. He reached across the desk and took her hand, and held it, and outside the window the horses were moving in the afternoon sun, and James was somewhere in the yard with Tomaz's patient supervision, and the land stretched out in every direction in the big, clear light of the New Mexico summer. Their second child came in the spring of 1888, and was a girl, which made Esteban's face do something Maude had never quite seen it do before, something very close to uncomplicated delight. They named her Clara, which was Clarence's mother's name, and Clara came into the world with the calm authority of a person who has decided things will be manageable, and they generally are. James, who was 3 and some months, took his role as older sibling with the particular gravity of a child who has been told he is important and has decided to believe it. He brought Clara gifts, mostly rocks and interesting sticks, and once a confused caterpillar, and placed them near her with ceremony. Clarence observed this solemnly and said nothing, which was the right response. Holt married in the summer of that year, a girl from a farm 20 miles east whose name was Sadie, a capable and cheerful person who Maude liked immediately, and Clarence nodded to with the expression that meant he approved. They set up a small house in town, and Holt continued to work at the ranch and became, in time, Clarence's most reliable hand and something close to a friend, which was not a category Clarence populated heavily but maintained with great loyalty. The years settled into each other the way good years do, each one distinct but all of them building toward something, toward the life that the ranch was becoming. There were hard years in the cattle industry in that decade. The terrible winter of 1886 and 1887 had devastated herds across the northern plains, though the Bristol operation had survived it better than many because of the diversification into horses. There were droughts and there were losses, and there were seasons when the accounts required careful management, and the decisions were not easy. But there were also mornings on the porch with coffee, and evenings by the fireplace with books, and the particular sound of children asleep in the house, and the horses moving in the paddock in the early light, and all the daily small exchanges between two people who had learned each other thoroughly and still chose each other every day, which is perhaps the truest test of love. James grew. He was a serious child with a talent for horses that appeared early and developed fast, and by the time he was 6, he was helping Tomaz with the morning feeding with genuine usefulness rather than merely honorary participation. Clara grew. She was different from James, more verbally inclined, more interested in the world of the house than the stable, and she had Maude's talent for numbers, which appeared at age 4 when she began sorting things into precise groups and reported the totals with satisfaction. "She is going to be trouble for someone's accounts someday," Clarence said, watching her organize a collection of stones with complete concentration. "She is going to be extraordinary," Maude said. "Same thing," he said, which was what she had said to him years ago in a different context, and she looked at him sideways and found him wearing the expression that meant he had done this intentionally. "You remember that," she said. "I remember everything you say," he said simply, and went back to whatever he had been doing, leaving her standing in the yard feeling the way she often felt when he said things like that, as though the ground under her feet were particularly solid. In 1890, Esteban retired from active ranch work. He was 60, and his knees had been a problem for 2 years, and the doctor who came out from Dusty Creek said that the heavy work needed to stop. Clarence told him directly that his house was his for as long as he wanted it, that there was nothing owed and nothing required, and that he and Maria were welcome to stay and do whatever they were comfortable with, which Maria interpreted as helping with the household when she chose, and Esteban interpreted as offering advice from a seated position whenever he had something to say, which was regularly. Tomás had by this point been on the ranch for 6 years and knew every acre of it as well as Clarence did. He stepped naturally into the foreman role, and 2 additional hands were hired, young men from the town, who were solid workers and integrated into the ranch operation without difficulty. The Bristol Ranch had become, by 1890, one of the more established operations in that part of the territory. The horse breeding program was its particular distinction, and the reputation of the Bristol quarter horses was genuinely excellent, built on 7 years of consistent quality. The accounts were healthy, the land was well managed, the relationships with the community in Dusty Creek and the surrounding area were sound. And every morning, in the kitchen of the ranch house, there was coffee made for 2 before the house fully woke, which was still a thing that Clarence did before anything else, the way a person maintains a habit that has become simply the way they are. Maude was 31 now, and she looked at her life and recognized it as hers in a way that felt fundamental. Not the life she had imagined in Missouri, not the life she had stumbled into in Santa Fe, but this one, the specific and irreplaceable life of Maude Bristol on a ranch north of Dusty Creek, New Mexico territory, with a man who was the roughest she had ever spoken to and the gentlest she had ever been treated by. She said this out loud once to Ruth Caldwell, on one of the afternoons when Ruth came out for tea, which she did periodically because she had decided years ago that Maude was good company and had not revised this opinion. "He was the roughest man I had ever spoken to," Maude said, pouring tea. "The day I rode in and he told me it was private property and looked at me like I was a fence post he was evaluating." Ruth laughed. "And now?" "And now he is the gentlest I have ever been treated by," Maude said, "which is not in contradiction of the first thing. It is just the rest of him." Ruth looked at her over the rim of her cup. "You know," she said, "when Dora told me about you back at the beginning, she said you were trouble in the best possible way." "Dora was right," Maude said. "She usually is," Ruth agreed. The fall of 1891 brought a visitor to the territory who caused a considerable stir. A federal land surveyor who was working on questions related to the allocation of land in advance of New Mexico's eventual statehood, which people had been discussing for years and which was inching, by the slowest possible degrees, toward actually happening. The surveyor came to the Bristol Ranch because the property records needed verification, a routine matter, but it required several days of work and documentation. During those several days, Maude worked with the surveyor on the documentation side of things, producing records she had been maintaining since 1883 with a completeness and precision that left the man visibly relieved. Most of the ranches he had visited had records that were incomplete or inconsistent, or in several cases simply missing. The Bristol records were a model of clarity. "Your wife keeps your books," he said to Clarence on the 3rd day, not with condescension but with genuine curiosity. "My wife manages the entire operation," Clarence said. "I manage the land and the animals. She manages everything else. Between us, nothing gets missed." The surveyor wrote something in his report. Maude suspected it was complimentary. After he left, Clarence and Maude sat on the porch in the evening, and Clarence said, "I want you to know something." "Tell me," she said. "When I said that to him about the operation, about both of us," he paused. "That is simply the truth of it. I want to make sure you know that I know that." She looked at him steadily. "I know you know that," she said. "You have never once suggested otherwise." "Good," he said. She reached over and took his hand. He turned it over and held hers back. The evening was settling over the land in its slow, gorgeous way, the sky going from orange to pink to the deep purple that preceded dark, and somewhere a mockingbird was running through its repertoire in the mesquite. "Clarence," she said, "I am glad I rode north on that road." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "So am I every single day." The winter of 1891 was cold and clear and full. James was 6 and Clara was 3, and the house had the particular energy of a place that contains children at those ages, which is to say, it was never entirely quiet and rarely entirely still. Clarence managed this with equanimity, which Maude thought was one of the most impressive things about him, that a man who preferred silence and order had learned to inhabit a noisy household with genuine pleasure rather than merely tolerance. He taught James to play checkers that winter, a long and patient process that involved many games in which Clarence won and James lost, and gradually, over weeks, began to understand why. The evening James won his first actual game, not because Clarence had let him, which he would not do, but because James had genuinely outmaneuvered him. Clarence sat back and said, "Well done," with a completeness of approval that James received like sunlight. Clara was at the stage where she demanded stories before sleep, and Maude told them, but so did Clarence, and his were remarkable, Maude thought, because they were never fantastical in the usual sense but were about real things, about horses and land, and weather and people, told with the patience and precision he brought to everything, but with a gentleness in the telling that she recognized as the best of him. There were nights when Maude came to the doorway of Clara's room and stood there listening to Clarence tell the story of how the ranch had been built, or how a particular horse had been trained, or what the stars looked like from the mesa to the west on a clear January night, and she thought that whatever she had understood about love before she had come to Dusty Creek had been a partial understanding, a sketch rather than the finished thing. The finished thing was this. It was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. It was the accounting ledger and the coffee and the hand held in the dark during a difficult labor, and the argument about the fence line on the north pasture that they had last spring and resolved the same day, because neither of them found it useful to let things fester. It was the way he looked at her across a room full of people, and she always knew exactly what he was thinking. It was the weight of a life shared so completely that the separate threads of it had become genuinely impossible to separate. By the spring of 1892, there was talk of another child. Not decided but talked about, in the way they talked about important things, directly and with full honesty about the circumstances. The accounts were strong, the operation was stable, James and Clara were both doing well. Maude felt ready and said so. Clarence said, "Whatever you want is what I want." She gave him a look. "That is not an answer." He met her eyes. "I want another child," he said. "I want as many children as you are willing to have and as are good for you. I also want you to be well, and I am not going to put the first thing ahead of the second." This was, she reflected, exactly the kind of answer that made him impossible to argue with, not because he was using strategy, but because he simply meant it. Their third child came in January of 1893, a boy, red-faced and already loud, whom they named Henry after Clarence's father, which made Clarence's expression do the thing it had done the first time, that enormous unguarded feeling that he did not try to contain. Henry was different from both James and Clara in ways that became apparent immediately. A child of appetite and enthusiasm and bottomless curiosity, who required more direct management than either of his siblings had, and provided more unintentional comedy per day than anything else on the ranch. Esteban, now retired and spending most of his days in the garden he had developed with extraordinary care behind his house, found Henry endlessly entertaining, and was the one person who could reliably make Henry sit still for more than 4 minutes, by the simple method of showing him things in the garden with patient interest. The Bristol Ranch in 1893 was a complete and living thing. The horses were its reputation, the cattle were its backbone, the people were its heart. Clarence managed the land with the wisdom that the land had, in fact, taught him through years of close attention. Maude managed the business with the precision and human intelligence that had always been her gift. Their children grew in the wide, clear air of the territory, learning the land as naturally as they learned everything else. Dusty Creek had grown too, in the decade since Maude had ridden into it with $4 in her pocket. There was a school now, a proper one with 2 teachers and a telegraph office, and 2 more general stores beside Dora Higgins's, and the lucky draw had been rebuilt with a 2nd floor. George Trout still managed it and still kept his bees, and had, in 1890, won a prize at the territorial fair for his honey, about which he had a great deal to say to anyone who asked, and several people who did not. Dora Higgins had taken Maude aside on one of her visits to town in 1892 and said, with the directness of a woman who has earned the right to it, "I want you to know that sending you north to that ranch was the best advice I have ever given anyone." Maude had hugged her, which was not something Dora was typically receptive to, but which she permitted on this occasion. The years settled on. James began helping with the horse training in earnest at age 8, and had by 9 a particular gift with the young horses, a patient steadiness that Clarence recognized and nurtured with careful instruction. Clara, at 6, had begun keeping a notebook of numbers, which Maude recognized as an instinct she had herself, and helped her develop with the same seriousness she brought to everything worth doing. Henry, at 3, was a force of nature who had recently taught himself to climb the paddock fence in 3 different places, and had been intercepted on each occasion by someone with different levels of alarm. Clarence found him on top of the fence post one afternoon, balanced there with the satisfaction of a person who has achieved a goal, and stood below him and said, "How are you planning to get down?" Henry considered this. "I have not decided yet," he said. Clarence helped him down, set him on the ground, and said, "When you have decided how to get down is when you climb up." Henry appeared to find this a reasonable principle, and applied it from then on with somewhat better results. In the evenings, after the children were asleep, Maude and Clarence sat together in the main room, as they had always done, in the chairs beside the fireplace, with tea or coffee, or sometimes just the silence of the room and the fire and the sound of the land outside the windows. The books that had overflowed Clarence's crate years ago now filled 2 proper shelves that he had built along the main room wall, and there were children's books among them now, adding their bright spines to the row, and the ledgers were in the office where they had always been, and the poems were on the shelf nearest Maude's chair, the small book with the turquoise-colored cover. Some evenings they talked. Some evenings they read. Some evenings, one of them said something that started a conversation that went long into the night, about the operation or the children or the territory or the wide questions of the world. And some evenings they said almost nothing at all, and found that equally satisfying. There was an evening in the summer of 1894 when they were both reading, and the light outside was going golden, and James and Clara were somewhere on the property, and Henry was asleep. And Maude looked up from her book and found Clarence watching her with an expression that was simply love, undisguised and full, the expression of a person looking at the thing they value most. She set her book down. "What?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking at you." She held his gaze, and he was quiet for a moment in the way that meant something was forming that he wanted to say correctly. Then he said, "I think about who I was before you came, and I find I cannot be very sorry about any of it because it was the road to here. But I am glad you came. I am very glad you are here." She crossed the room and sat beside him in the large chair that had always been his, which was large enough for 2 if they did not insist on being formal about it. And he put his arm around her and she leaned against him. And outside the windows the summer evening was extraordinary, the sky going through its evening changes, and the horses were moving slowly in the paddock, and somewhere on the property their children were somewhere safe. "I am very glad I am here," she said. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. They sat there in the evening of a good life, fully arrived, fully present, fully certain of each other, As the sky went from gold to rose to the deep velvet dark that came in over the New Mexico territory every night and covered everything equally. The rough and the gentle, the earned and the given, the thing that had been built from $4.60 and a bruised jaw and a road going north, and a man who said this is private property, and meant eventually, somehow, make yourself at home. The night deepened, the stars came out. Somewhere across the dark a coyote called, the same sound that had accompanied their first New Year together, and Clarence Bristol and Maude Barrett Bristol were exactly where they were supposed to be, in the middle of a life they had built together out of honesty and patience, and the particular daily courage of choosing each other, over and over, in all the ordinary moments that add up to everything. And it was enough, more than enough. It was, in every way that counted, exactly right.